Thunder cracked across the northern ridge, and somewhere below the tree line, a small wolf pup lay caught between two rocks, its back leg twisted at a painful angle. Rain hammered the ground. The pup's cries were thin and desperate, rising and falling with each gust of wind, yet the warriors of the Blackthorn territory walked past without slowing their steps. Garrick, a broad-shouldered guard with a scar across his jaw, glanced at the shaking animal and shook his head. Not worth the trouble, he muttered to the wolf beside him, and the two continued toward the training grounds as if the sound behind them belonged to nothing more than the wind. Lyra had been collecting firewood near the ridge when she heard it. She stopped mid-step, her arms full of damp branches, and turned toward the sound. Most wolves in the territory would have kept walking, the way Garrick had. Lyra was not most wolves. She had learned, the hard way, what it felt like to be the one everyone stepped around. She dropped the firewood and ran. The pup was smaller than she expected, its fur soaked and matted, its side rising and falling too fast. When it saw her, it tried to scramble back, teeth bared in a weak attempt at defense, but the movement made it whimper and collapse again. Lyra knelt slowly, keeping her hands low and open, the way her father had taught her before he died. "I am not going to hurt you," she said softly. "I promise." The pup's brown eyes, wide and frightened, locked onto hers. For a long moment neither of them moved. Then, as if some quiet understanding passed between them, the pup stopped struggling and let out a breath that sounded almost like relief. Lyra examined the wound as gently as she could. The leg was not broken, but a metal trap, likely set by hunters from beyond the border, had bitten deep enough to draw blood and swelling. If left untreated through the night, infection would take hold quickly. She had seen it happen before, to wolves far stronger than this small creature. She glanced back toward the pack house in the distance, its windows glowing with warm light, laughter drifting faintly through the storm. Someone there would know how to help. Someone there had bandages, herbs, a warm fire. But Lyra also knew what would happen if she walked through those gates carrying an injured pup that did not belong to any known family. Questions would follow. Accusations would follow faster. 3 years had passed since her father, the last person who ever looked at her with pride, had died defending the eastern border. 3 years since the pack had quietly decided that without his protection, Lyra was no longer worth acknowledging. She had been given the lowest rank a wolf could hold. Omega. A title that meant nothing and yet somehow meant everything, because it decided how every single person treated her from that day forward. She had learned not to expect help. She had learned, more painfully, not to ask for it. But the pup needed her, and there was no time to weigh the cost of kindness against the cost of another whispered insult. "Come on," she said, carefully sliding her arms beneath its trembling body. "I've got you." The pup did not resist. It pressed its small head against her chest, and Lyra felt something tighten in her throat, something she had not let herself feel in a long time. She rose to her feet and began the long walk back to her cabin at the edge of the territory, the wind pushing against her with every step, rain soaking through her thin coat. She did not know that she was being watched. High above the ridge, hidden in the shadow of an old oak, a pair of golden eyes tracked her every movement. Alpha Cassius Blackthorn had not intended to witness anything that night. He had gone to the ridge alone, as he often did, to think in silence away from the noise of the pack house. But when he saw the small shape of the pup caught in the trap, something inside him had gone very still. He recognized that pup. It was Theo, his nephew. The son of his late brother, cursed 3 days earlier by a witch loyal to a rival pack, trapped in wolf form until the curse could be broken. Cassius had ordered the search quietly, without alarming the pack, hoping to find the boy before anyone else did. He had not expected to find him bleeding in a trap at the edge of the training grounds while his own warriors walked past without a glance. He had wanted to test something. Word had reached him, over the past several months, of a growing coldness spreading through his people, ambition and status mattering more than compassion, rank mattering more than kindness. He needed to know if it was true. So when he saw Theo trapped, he made a decision that surprised even himself. He stayed hidden. He watched. He watched Garrick walk past. He watched 2 young warriors laugh about something unrelated, stepping neatly around the whimpering animal as if it were nothing more than a puddle in their path. He watched, jaw tightening, as one wolf paused just long enough to sneer before continuing on. And then he watched Lyra. She had nothing. No rank, no protection, no reason to risk anything for a stranger's pup. And yet she had run toward the sound when everyone else had run from it. Cassius followed at a distance, staying low against the tree line, careful not to be seen. He watched her carry the pup through the storm, speaking softly the entire way, her voice steady even as her arms visibly shook with the effort. He watched her reach the small cabin she called home, a modest structure near the edge of the territory, far from the warmth of the pack house. He did not follow her inside. Not yet. Instead, he settled at a distance where he could still see the glow of her window through the rain, and he waited, curious despite himself, to see what kind of person she truly was when she believed no one was watching. Inside, Lyra laid the pup gently on a folded blanket near the small fire she kept burning through the cold months. Her hands moved quickly, pulling clean cloth strips from a drawer, warming water in a pot, searching her shelf for the herbs her father had once taught her to use for wounds like this. She had little food stored for herself that week, but she did not hesitate to set aside her own dinner, a small portion of bread and dried meat, and instead used what warmth she had to keep the pup comfortable. "You're safe now," she whispered, cleaning the wound with careful, practiced movements. "I know it hurts. I know. Just a little longer." The pup whimpered but did not pull away. Its eyes stayed fixed on her face, following her every movement as though searching for reassurance. Lyra hummed quietly, an old, wordless tune her mother used to sing before she too had passed, years earlier. She did not know why she still remembered the melody. She only knew that in moments like this, it seemed to help. Outside, through the rain-streaked window, Cassius watched everything. He had expected to find nothing remarkable. A stranger who happened to notice suffering others ignored, perhaps, but nothing more. Instead, he found himself unable to look away. There was something in the way she spoke to a creature that could not answer her, something in the patience of her hands and the steadiness of her voice despite her own exhaustion, that struck him harder than he expected. For years, Cassius had ruled as the alpha king of Blackthorn territory with a calm, guarded distance. He had watched countless wolves compete for his attention, for status, for a place beside him. He had grown used to ambition dressed up as loyalty, and flattery dressed up as devotion. He had almost forgotten what real kindness looked like, kindness given freely, without an audience, without anything expected in return. He watched the woman everyone called an Omega tend to his nephew as though the boy's life mattered more than her own comfort, and for the first time in a long time, something shifted in his chest. Not simple curiosity. Not only respect. Something quieter, and far more dangerous to the careful control he had built around himself for years. The pup, exhausted from pain and the long walk through the storm, finally allowed its eyes to close, its breathing slow and even at last. Lyra sat back against the wall, watching the small chest rise and fall, relief washing over her tired face. "Rest," she murmured. "Tomorrow will be easier." She had no idea how wrong, and how right, those words would prove to be. Outside, the storm began to soften into a quiet drizzle, and Cassius remained beneath the shelter of the old oak long after the light in her window dimmed. He told himself he would leave once he confirmed the pup was safe. He told himself this changed nothing. But as he finally turned to walk back toward the pack house, his thoughts stayed fixed on the small cabin behind him, and on the woman his entire pack had chosen to overlook. He intended to return at first light. He had questions only she could answer, and for reasons he did not yet want to examine too closely, he found that he was not in any hurry to stay away. The first light of morning had barely touched the treetops when a sharp knock rattled Lyra's door, and her heart lurched with instant fear. No one ever knocked on her door. No one had reason to. She rose quickly, glancing at the pup still curled on the blanket by the dying fire. It stirred at the sound but did not wake. Lyra crossed the small room and opened the door only a crack, expecting a warrior sent to drag her before the pack council for some invented offense. Instead, she found no one standing there at all. The porch was empty, rain dripping steadily from the wooden overhang, the forest beyond wrapped in grey morning mist. She frowned, stepping half outside to look in both directions, and that was when she heard it. A low groan came from behind her, from the direction of the fire. Lyra spun around, and what she saw made every thought in her mind go silent. The pup was gone. In its place, curled on the same blanket, lay a boy no older than 10, his skin pale, his dark hair damp with sweat, a fresh wound visible on his leg in almost exactly the spot where the pup had been injured. He groaned again, his eyelids fluttering, disoriented and clearly in pain. For a moment, Lyra could not move. She had heard stories of shifted curses before, whispered tales passed between older wolves about witches powerful enough to trap a person between forms, but she had never actually witnessed one break. She had never expected to be the one standing over a child when it happened. "Hey," she said gently, kneeling beside him despite her racing heart. "Hey, can you hear me?" The boy's eyes opened slowly, unfocused at first, then sharpening with confusion as he took in the unfamiliar room around him. "Where?" he rasped, "where am I?" "You're safe," Lyra said, keeping her voice as calm as she could manage despite the storm of questions running through her mind. "I found you last night. You were hurt. I brought you here to help you." The boy studied her face for a long moment, his breathing still uneven, and then something like recognition flickered behind his eyes. "You're the one who carried me," he whispered. "I remember your voice." Before Lyra could respond, a second knock came at the door, firmer this time, and her stomach dropped. She rose slowly, glancing back at the boy, silently urging him to stay still, and crossed the room to open it. She had expected almost anyone. She had not expected the Alpha King himself standing on her porch, rain still clinging to his dark hair, his golden eyes fixed directly on her with an intensity that made her breath catch. "Alpha Cassius," she said quickly, dropping into an immediate bow, her pulse hammering in her ears. Omegas did not receive visits from the Alpha King. Omegas were fortunate if the Alpha King remembered their names at all. "I did not expect, that is, I was not informed that you would. I mean, is there something you require of me?" "Rise," Cassius said, his voice low but not unkind. "There is no need for that." Lyra straightened slowly, unsure what expression to hold, unsure what crime she was about to be accused of. Her mind raced through every possible explanation, every possible punishment, for taking in a pup that clearly did not belong to her, on park land that technically belonged to him. "I believe," Cassius continued, his gaze moving past her shoulder toward the small figure now sitting upright on the blanket, "that you are currently caring for someone very important to me." Lyra's blood went cold. "Alpha, I swear, I did not know who he was. I only saw an injured pup. I would never presume to interfere with pack matters. I only wanted to help him. I did not mean any disrespect by bringing him into my home. Please, if there is a punishment, I will accept it, but he needed care and no one else stopped to give it." The words stumbled out faster than she could control them, years of learned fear rising to the surface all at once. She had seen what happened to wolves who overstepped their place, even with good intentions. Kindness rarely protected an Omega from consequences. Cassius held up a hand, and something in his expression softened slightly, though his eyes remained sharp with an emotion she could not quite name. "You misunderstand me," he said. "You are not in trouble. You have done nothing wrong." Lyra blinked, caught completely off guard. "I do not understand." "That boy," Cassius said, stepping past her gently to kneel beside Theo, checking the wound on his leg with careful, practiced hands, "is my nephew. 3 days ago, a witch loyal to a rival pack placed a curse on him during a border skirmish, trapping him in wolf form. My warriors and I searched every corner of this territory to find him before the curse could take permanent hold. I found him last night at the edge of the training grounds, caught in a trap left by outsiders, and I watched every single warrior who passed him by." Lyra's stomach twisted. "You saw them ignore him." "I saw everyone ignore him," Cassius said quietly, his jaw tightening at the memory. "Every single wolf who walked past that ridge last night saw a suffering creature and decided it was not their concern. Every wolf except you." "I did not know he was your nephew," Lyra said again, quieter this time. "I would have helped him regardless." "I know," Cassius said, and something in the way he said it made her chest tighten unexpectedly. "That is precisely why I followed you home." The confession hung in the air between them, heavier than either of them seemed prepared for. Lyra felt heat rise to her face, uncertain how to respond to an alpha king admitting he had watched her through her own window without her knowledge, and yet strangely unable to feel anger about it. There had been no cruelty in his gaze. Only something that looked almost like gratitude. Theo, watching the exchange with wide, curious eyes, finally spoke up. "She sang to me," he said, his voice still rough from disuse. "When the pain got bad. She sang, and it helped." Cassius turned back to look at Lyra with an expression she could not fully read, something between surprise and quiet wonder. "Did she?" Lyra felt her face grow warmer still and busied herself gathering fresh cloth to redress Theo's wound, if only to give her hands something to do besides tremble under the weight of the Alpha King's attention. "The one needs proper treatment," she said, focusing on the practical matter at hand rather than the storm of emotion swelling in her chest. "It is healing, but slowly. He should rest another day before attempting to walk far." "Then he will rest here," Cassius said simply, "under your care, until I am certain the wound has closed properly. I will send healers to assist you, and food, and anything else you require." "That is not necessary," Lyra said quickly, an old instinct rising in her, the instinct to refuse anything that might draw further attention to herself, anything that might invite the resentment of higher-ranked wolves. "I can manage on my own." "I do not doubt that you can," Cassius said, his voice firm but gentle. "But you should not have to. You gave up your own dinner last night to keep a stranger's pup warm. You will not be doing the same for my nephew while I have the ability to provide otherwise." Lyra opened her mouth to argue further, but something in his expression told her the matter was already decided. She had learned, over 3 years of survival, when a battle was not worth fighting, and this, she suspected, was one of them. Theo, meanwhile, had shifted his attention entirely away from the tension between the two adults and toward the modest cabin around him, his sharp eyes taking in every detail with the curiosity only a child could manage even after days of pain and confusion. "Is this really where you live?" he asked Lyra, tilting his head. "It's small." "Theo," Cassius said, a warning edge creeping into his voice, though something like amusement flickered briefly across his face. "It's fine," Lyra said, a small, unexpected smile tugging at the corner of her mouth despite everything. "Yes, this is where I live. It is small, but it is warm, and it is mine. I like it," Theo said decisively, as though his opinion settled the matter entirely. "It smells like the herbs my mother used to use." Something flickered across the boy's face at the mention of his mother, a shadow of grief that Lyra recognized instantly, having carried a version of it herself since her father's death. She glanced at Cassius, who gave the smallest nod, confirming the loss without needing to say the words aloud. "She would be glad," Lyra said gently, kneeling beside Theo again to check the bandage, "that someone took good care of you." Theo studied her for a long moment, then nodded slowly, some of the tension leaving his small shoulders. "Uncle Cassius says you're an Omega," he said, with the blunt honesty only children seemed capable of. "But you don't act like the ones the others talk about." "Theo," Cassius said again, sharper this time, though his eyes flicked briefly, almost apologetically, toward Lyra. "It is fine," Lyra said quietly, though the words still settled uncomfortably in her chest, a reminder of exactly how the rest of the pack viewed someone in her position. Rank does not decide who someone is. It only decides how they are treated. Cassius studied her carefully at that, something shifting behind his golden eyes, an idea forming that he did not yet share aloud. He had spent years watching his pack slowly lose sight of the values that once made Blackthorn territory strong under his father's rule, values of loyalty and compassion rather than status and ambition. He had begun to fear those values were disappearing entirely. Standing in a small, humble cabin at the edge of his territory, watching an Omega tend to his nephew's wounds with more genuine care than half his court had ever shown anyone, Cassius began to suspect he had finally found proof that he was wrong. "I will send healers within the hour," he said finally, rising to his feet. "And I will return this evening to check on Theo's progress myself." Lyra glanced up, startled. "You do not need to trouble yourself with such a visit, Alpha. I am capable of sending word if anything changes." "I am aware that you are capable," Cassius said, and something in his tone made her pulse quicken again, though she could not have explained why. "I choose to return regardless." He left without further explanation, stepping out into the misty morning air, leaving Lyra standing in her small cabin with a boy who did not belong to her, a wound that was slowly healing, and a growing, uneasy suspicion that her quiet, overlooked life was about to change in ways she was not entirely prepared to face. Outside, as Cassius made his way back toward the pack house, his mind remained fixed not on the political matters awaiting him, nor on the border tension still simmering with the rival pack responsible for Theo's curse, but on the woman he had left behind. For years, he had told himself that a king's duty left no room for distraction, that his position demanded constant vigilance and careful judgment above all else. Yet as the mist curled around him and the memory of her steady voice echoed in his thoughts, Cassius found himself, for the first time in longer than he cared to admit, looking forward to the evening ahead with something dangerously close to anticipation. By the time evening fell, word had already spread through every corner of the pack house, carried faster than any messenger could have managed. The Alpha King had been seen twice in one day walking toward the edge of the territory, toward the cabin belonging to the Omega everyone had spent years pretending not to notice. Delphine heard the news while adjusting the silver pins in her hair, preparing for what she still believed would be a quiet, uneventful evening. She was a beta of considerable standing, daughter of one of the oldest families in Blackthorn territory, and for the past year she had operated under the confident assumption that she would eventually become Cassius's chosen mate. Their families had spoken of the match for months. Nothing had been formally announced, but nothing about it had ever felt uncertain, not until now. "Say that again," she said sharply to the young wolf who had brought her the news, her hand freezing mid-motion above her hair. "The Alpha visited the Omega's cabin this morning," the young wolf repeated nervously, clearly unsettled by the sudden change in Delphine's expression. "And healers were sent there within the hour. Word is his nephew is recovering there as well." Delphine's jaw tightened, though she forced her voice to remain composed. "That is unusual," she said carefully. "Perhaps there is a simple explanation." But even as she said the words, something cold and unwelcome settled in her chest, a feeling she was not accustomed to and did not care for in the slightest. Meanwhile, at the small cabin, Lyra had spent the entire day adjusting to a version of her life she barely recognized. Two healers, an older woman named Nadia and a younger man named Finn, had arrived within the hour just as promised, bringing supplies far beyond what Lyra's modest shelves usually held. They treated Theo's wound with practiced efficiency, praised the initial care Lyra had already given him, and left behind enough food to last her nearly 2 weeks. Theo, for his part, had spent much of the day recovering his strength while peppering Lyra with an endless stream of questions about her life, her home, and whether she had ever seen a real dragon, a question she answered honestly by admitting she had not, which seemed to disappoint him greatly. "Uncle Cassius says dragons don't exist anymore," Theo said, propped up against a cushion Nadia had brought for him. "But I think he's just saying that so I don't ask to go looking for one." "That does sound like something an Alpha King might say," Lyra replied, unable to fully suppress a small smile as she folded fresh linens Nadia had left behind. "Do you like him?" Theo asked suddenly, with the same blunt honesty he had shown that morning. Lyra nearly dropped the linens in her hands. "I do not know your uncle well enough to form an opinion of him," she said carefully, focusing intently on the folding in front of her. "That's not what I asked," Theo said, grinning in a way that suggested he was far more perceptive than a boy his age had any right to be. Before Lyra could respond, a firm knock sounded at the door, and her pulse quickened instinctively, though this time she suspected exactly who stood on the other side. Cassius arrived precisely as he had promised, his presence somehow filling the small cabin the moment he stepped through the doorway. He greeted Theo first, checking on his condition with visible relief at the boy's improved color and steadier breathing, before finally turning his attention to Lyra. "The healers tell me his recovery is progressing faster than expected," he said. "They credit your initial treatment with preventing infection from setting in." "I only did what anyone would have done," Lyra said quietly. "We both know that is not true," Cassius replied, his voice quiet but firm. "I watched an entire ridge of warriors prove otherwise last night." Lyra had no response to that, so she said nothing at all, focusing instead on preparing a simple meal for the evening, uncomfortably aware of Cassius's presence as he settled onto a wooden chair near the fire, seemingly in no hurry to leave. They spoke, over the course of that evening, about matters that had nothing to do with rank or politics. Cassius asked about her father, and Lyra found herself, unexpectedly, sharing memories she had not spoken aloud in years, memories of a man who had taught her to track wounded animals through the forest, who had believed that strength meant protecting those who could not protect themselves, rather than dominating those who could. He sounds like he would have made an excellent warrior under any alpha, Cassius said quietly. He was, Lyra said. Until the day he wasn't. Cassius did not press further, understanding instinctively that some wounds needed time rather than questions. Instead, he shared, in careful, measured words, something of his own losses, the brother he had lost to the same rival pack now responsible for Theo's curse, the weight of ruling a territory that seemed to be slowly losing sight of the values his father had once instilled in it. By the time Cassius finally rose to leave that night, something had shifted between them, subtle but undeniable, a quiet understanding neither of them fully acknowledged aloud. This pattern continued over the following days. Cassius returned each evening under the reasonable pretense of checking on Theo's recovery, and each evening, the conversations between himself and Lyra grew longer, more comfortable, more difficult to explain away as simple courtesy. Theo, delighted by the arrangement, made no effort to hide his approval, often finding reasons to leave the two adults alone under increasingly transparent excuses about needing rest. Word of these visits, of course, continued to spread. By the end of the first week, whispers had transformed into open speculation throughout the pack house. Warriors who had once ignored Lyra entirely now watched her with narrowed, calculating eyes whenever she was summoned to the pack house to collect supplies for Theo's care. Servants exchanged pointed glances. And Delphine, whose patience had worn thin days earlier, finally decided the situation required direct intervention. She found Lyra alone one afternoon near the pack house gardens, collecting herbs Nadia had requested for Theo's continued treatment. Delphine approached with the practiced grace of someone who had spent her entire life commanding respect through presence alone. "You must be quite pleased with yourself," Delphine said, her voice pleasant on the surface, sharp beneath it. Lyra straightened slowly, recognizing the tone immediately, though she kept her expression carefully neutral. "I am simply gathering herbs," beta Delphine. "I have no reason to feel any particular way about it." "Do not insult my intelligence," Delphine said, stepping closer, her voice dropping lower though the warmth in it had vanished entirely. An Omega with no family, no status, and no future suddenly finds herself hosting the Alpha King in her own home, night after night. "Do you truly expect me to believe there is nothing more to this than concern for a child's recovery?" "I did not seek his attention," Lyra said carefully, refusing to look away despite the discomfort tightening in her chest. "I only helped a pup that everyone else chose to ignore." "How convenient," Delphine said, her lips curling into something that resembled a smile but held none of its warmth, that helping a stranded animal happened to be the very same pup that belonged to the Alpha King's own family. "I did not know who he was," Lyra said. "I would have helped him regardless of his identity." "Perhaps," Delphine said. "Or perhaps you knew exactly what you were doing." The implication hung heavily in the air, and Lyra felt her stomach twist uncomfortably, an old, familiar fear rising within her, the fear of being blamed for something entirely outside her control, simply because her existence had become inconvenient to someone with more power than she possessed. "I have no interest in the Alpha's position," Lyra said finally, keeping her voice steady despite the tremor she felt building beneath it. "I only wanted to help a child in pain." Delphine studied her for a long, silent moment, something calculating shifting behind her eyes. "See that it remains that way," she said finally. "Because if I discover otherwise, I promise you, Omega, the consequences will not be gentle." She turned and walked away without waiting for a response, leaving Lyra standing alone among the herbs, her hands trembling slightly as she resumed her walk, the warning settling deep and cold in her chest. That evening, when Cassius arrived at the cabin as usual, he immediately noticed the shift in Lyra's demeanor, the careful distance she maintained, the forced steadiness in her voice that had not been present the night before. "Something troubles you," he said, once Theo had drifted off to sleep by the fire. "It is nothing," Lyra said quickly, focusing on tasks that did not require her to meet his eyes. "Lyra," Cassius said, his voice quiet but insistent, using her name directly for what felt like the first time. "I would rather you tell me the truth than watch you carry a burden alone." The use of her name, spoken so plainly, so directly, without title or distance, caught her off guard enough that the careful composure she had built throughout the day finally cracked. Beta Delphine approached me today, she admitted quietly. She made it clear that she believes I have manipulated your attention deliberately. She warned me of consequences if she discovers otherwise. Cassius's expression darkened, something sharp and protective flashing behind his golden eyes. She had no right to threaten you. She has every right, according to the structure of this pack, Lyra said, a bitter edge creeping into her voice despite her efforts to remain calm. I am an Omega, Alpha Cassius. My safety has never been guaranteed by anything beyond the goodwill of those with more power than myself, and goodwill is not something Beta Delphine seems inclined to offer. You are safe, Cassius said firmly, because I say you are safe. That protection does not depend on Delphine's opinion, nor anyone else's. With respect, Lyra said carefully, protection offered by an Alpha King can change as quickly as an Alpha King's circumstances change. I have learned not to depend on promises that exist only as long as convenience allows. The words landed harder than she intended, and she saw something shift behind Cassius's expression, not anger, but a quiet, troubled acknowledgement that her fear, however uncomfortable to hear, was not without foundation. He had watched his own pack grow colder over the years. He understood, better than most, how quickly loyalty could bend beneath the weight of ambition. Then I will make certain, he said finally, his voice low and resolute, that this promise is not one built on convenience. Lyra said nothing further that evening, uncertain what to make of a promise so firmly given by someone whose position could, theoretically, undo it just as easily. But something in the steadiness of his gaze made her want, despite every hard lesson she had learned over the past 3 years, to believe him. Over the following days, tension within the pack house continued to rise. Rumors multiplied faster than truth could correct them, and Delphine, growing increasingly desperate as Cassius's visits to the cabin showed no sign of slowing, began quietly gathering allies among wolves who resented the shifting attention as much as she did. Meanwhile, far beyond the borders of Blackthorn territory, the rival pack responsible for Theo's curse had not abandoned their ambitions. Scouts had already been dispatched to monitor the aftermath of their failed attack, and reports soon reached their leadership that the boy meant to secure the advantage over Blackthorn territory had somehow survived, his curse broken by unknown means. This news did not sit well with those who had orchestrated the attack in the first place, and within their own hidden council, plans quickly began forming for a second, more direct attempt, one that would not rely on curses or trickery, but on force strong enough to ensure no rescue would be possible this time. Neither Lyra nor Cassius yet understood how quickly the fragile peace surrounding Theo's recovery was about to be tested, nor how deeply the coming danger would threaten everything they had both begun, cautiously and against their better judgment, to hope for. A scream tore through the pack house gardens just before dawn, sharp enough to wake half the territory, and Lyra was on her feet and running before she even realized what her body was doing. She had been staying in a small guest room near the healer's quarters for the past 2 nights, at Nadia's insistence, so she could assist with Theo's care through the night as his strength continued to return. When the scream came, she grabbed nothing but her own instinct and sprinted toward the sound, her heart pounding against her ribs. She found Theo's room empty, the window shattered outward, glass scattered across the floor and the grass below. A guard lay unconscious near the doorway, a shadow wound across his shoulder, and Nadia stood frozen in the hallway, her face pale with shock. They took him, Nadia said, her voice shaking. 2 wolves, unfamiliar scent, they came through the window and were gone before anyone could raise the alarm. Lyra's blood turned to ice. Where is Cassius? Within minutes, the entire pack house had erupted into controlled chaos, warriors gathering weapons and forming search parties, Cassius himself emerging from his chambers with a fury in his eyes that Lyra had never witnessed before, cold and absolute. Track the scent, he ordered, his voice carrying across the courtyard with an authority that silenced every whisper instantly. Whoever did this will not leave this territory alive. Lyra stepped forward before she could stop herself. Let me help search. Cassius turned toward her, and for a brief moment, something flickered across his face, a war between his instinct to protect her and his understanding that she, more than anyone else present, had already proven capable of finding what others overlooked. Stay close to Garrick's group, he said finally. Do not act alone. She nodded, though the promise felt hollow the moment she made it. If Theo was in danger, she doubted very much that caution would be the first thing on her mind. The search parties fanned out across the territory as the sun rose, tracking the unfamiliar scent toward the eastern border, the same border where Lyra's father had died years earlier, the same border that marked the edge of Blackthorn land before rival territory began. The trail led through dense forest, over rocky terrain, until it finally converged near an old, abandoned watchtower long since claimed by moss and time. Garrick's group moved cautiously, but Lyra, driven by an urgency she could not fully explain, found herself moving faster than the others, her attention locked onto a faint whimper carried on the wind, one only someone familiar with that particular sound would recognize. "This way," she said, breaking away from the group despite Garrick's sharp protest behind her. She reached the base of the watchtower just as two unfamiliar wolves emerged from its shadow, dragging Tail between them, his hands bound, a cloth tied roughly over his mouth to muffle his cries. His eyes widened with desperate relief the moment he saw her. "Let him go," Lyra said, forcing steadiness into her voice despite the fear coiling tightly in her chest. The larger of the two wolves sneered, stepping forward with deliberate menace. "An Omega, alone, giving orders. How amusing." "She is not alone," came Cassius's voice, low and dangerous, as he emerged from the tree line with a dozen warriors flanking him, Garrick among them, having caught up just moments behind Lyra. The rival wolves exchanged a quick, calculating glance, clearly having expected an easier escape than the one now unfolding before them. The larger wolf tightened his grip on Tail, using the boy as a shield against the approaching warriors. "One more step," the wolf warned, "and the boy suffers for it." Cassius's expression remained deadly calm, though every muscle in his body radiated barely restrained fury. "You will release him, or you will not leave this forest standing." Lyra's mind raced, searching for something, anything, that might tip the balance before the situation escalated into violence that could easily cost Tail his life in the chaos. Her eyes fell on the uneven, moss-covered ground near the base of the watchtower, and an idea formed as quickly as the danger demanded. "He's still recovering," she said suddenly, directing her words toward the wolves holding him, her voice steady despite her racing pulse. "His leg has not fully healed. If you drag him further, you risk reopening the wound, and a bleeding hostage is far less useful to whoever sent you than a healthy one." The smaller of the two captors glanced down at Tail's leg, uncertainty flickering across his expression, exactly the distraction Lyra had hoped to create. In that brief moment of hesitation, Tail, quick-witted despite his fear, twisted sharply against his captor's loosened grip and threw himself sideways onto the ground, rolling away from both wolves entirely. Chaos erupted instantly. Cassius surged forward with terrifying speed, and the warriors around him closed in just as quickly. Lyra rushed toward Tail, shielding him with her own body as the confrontation unfolded around them, careful to keep him low and protected from the sudden burst of movement. The fight was brief but fierce, Cassius's warriors vastly outnumbering the two captors who had clearly expected an unguarded, unsupervised rescue attempt rather than a fully mobilized search party. Within minutes, both rival wolves had been subdued, restrained, and separated for questioning, their plans for a second attack on Blackthorn territory effectively unraveled before they could ever be set into motion. Cassius reached Tail and Lyra only moments after the fighting ended, dropping to his knees beside them both, his hands trembling slightly as he confirmed his nephew was unharmed beyond a few minor scrapes. "You are safe," he said, his voice rough with relief, pulling Tail into a firm embrace. "You are safe now." "She saved me," Tail said quietly, still shaking from the ordeal, his eyes finding Lyra's. "She figured out how to trick them before anyone else even got close." Cassius turned to Lyra, something raw and unguarded visible in his expression, an emotion far too complicated to name in the middle of a forest still tense with the aftermath of violence. "You were told to stay with Garrick's group." "I heard him," Lyra said simply, exhaustion beginning to creep into her voice now that the danger had passed. "I could not wait." Cassius studied her for a long moment, something between frustration and overwhelming gratitude warring behind his eyes, before he finally reached out and gently touched her shoulder, a small, simple gesture that carried far more weight than either of them fully acknowledged in that moment. "Thank you," he said quietly. The journey back to the pack house felt different from the tense search that had preceded it, relief settling over the group despite the seriousness of what had nearly happened. Tail, recovering quickly from his fear once safely back among familiar faces, could not stop recounting the story to anyone willing to listen, embellishing certain details with each retelling until Lyra's simple trick had transformed, in his excited narration, into something resembling an elaborate strategy worthy of the oldest war stories. Not everyone within the pack house received the news with relief, however. Delphine, informed of the failed kidnapping and Lyra's role in preventing it, felt the last of her patience finally give way entirely. The narrative spreading through the pack house, one that painted the previously overlooked Omega as quick-thinking and brave, threatened to undo months of careful positioning Delphine had built toward securing her own place beside Cassius. She acted that same evening, cornering a young, easily influenced servant named Oscar in a quiet hallway, offering him a modest sum of coin in exchange for spreading a very different version of events, one suggesting that Lyra's timely arrival at the watchtower had been far too convenient to be coincidental, that perhaps she had known of the kidnapping plot beforehand. Perhaps she had even orchestrated the entire ordeal herself to secure the Alpha King's gratitude and affection. The rumor spread quickly, as rumors within the pack house always did, twisting truth into something unrecognizable within a single day. By the following morning, whispers questioning Lyra's involvement in Theo's rescue had reached nearly every corner of Blackthorn territory, the gratitude of the previous evening curdling rapidly into suspicion. Lyra first heard the accusations while collecting supplies near the pack house kitchens, catching fragments of hushed conversation that stopped abruptly the moment she entered the room. She said nothing, though the weight of the sudden silence settled heavily in her chest, an old, familiar feeling of being watched, judged, and found guilty before ever being given the chance to defend herself. By midday, the rumors had grown bold enough that a formal accusation reached the pack council itself, demanding Lyra's presence to answer for her supposed involvement in the very kidnapping plot she had helped prevent. Exhausted, frightened, and painfully aware of how quickly gratitude could transform into blame when someone with sufficient influence decided it should, Lyra found herself seriously considering, for the first time since Cassius's visits had begun, whether it might simply be safer to leave Blackthorn territory entirely rather than continue enduring accusations she seemed destined never to escape. It was Theo who refused to allow that outcome. Overhearing the council's summons from where he rested nearby, the young boy pushed himself upright despite Nadia's protests, his expression set with a determination far beyond his years. "They are wrong," he said firmly, his voice carrying more conviction than anyone expected from someone so young. "And I am not going to let them say these things about her without telling the truth myself." Cassius, informed of the growing situation, arrived just as Theo prepared to march toward the council chamber alone, his small frame radiating a stubborn resolve that reminded Cassius sharply of his late brother. "I will go with you," Cassius said, placing a steady hand on his nephew's shoulder, before turning toward Lyra with an expression that left no room for doubt. "And so will she. This ends today." For the first time in longer than she could remember, Lyra found herself walking toward judgment not entirely alone, flanked by an Alpha King whose protection, she was beginning to allow herself to believe, might finally prove to be more than simply convenient. The council chamber doors slammed open before Cassius had even finished crossing the threshold, and every whispered conversation inside died instantly at the sight of him, Lyra and Theo walking steadily at his side. The chamber was packed. Word of the accusations against Lyra had spread far enough that half the pack house had gathered to witness the outcome, some out of genuine concern, many others simply hungry for spectacle. Delphine sat near the front, composed and confident, her expression carefully arranged into one of solemn concern, as though she bore no responsibility whatsoever for the rumors currently threatening to destroy a woman who had done nothing but save a child's life. "Alpha," said one of the older council members, rising quickly from his seat, clearly uncomfortable at the unexpected sight of Cassius arriving personally rather than allowing the council to handle the matter independently. "We did not expect you to attend this proceeding." "I attend anything that concerns the safety and reputation of those under my protection," Cassius said, his voice carrying easily through the silent chamber. "Especially when that reputation is being destroyed by lies." Murmurs rippled through the gathered crowd. Delphine's composed expression flickered, just barely, before settling back into place. "With respect, Alpha," Delphine said smoothly, rising from her seat with practiced grace, "the council has a duty to investigate any concerns raised regarding the safety of your nephew. Surely you would not wish us to ignore legitimate questions simply because the accused happens to enjoy your personal favor." "Legitimate questions," Cassius repeated, his voice deceptively calm, "would require legitimate evidence." "What evidence, precisely, supports the claim that Lyra orchestrated a kidnapping attempt against the very child she risked her own life to protect?" Delphine hesitated, clearly having expected this confrontation to unfold with far more distance between herself and direct scrutiny. There have been consistent reports, she said carefully, suggesting her involvement was, at the very least, suspiciously convenient. Reports from whom? Cassius asked. The chamber fell silent. Delphine's gaze flickered briefly toward the back of the room, toward Oscar, who suddenly seemed extremely interested in studying the floor beneath his feet. I believe, Theo said suddenly, stepping forward before anyone could stop him, his young voice carrying with surprising strength through the tense silence, that I should be allowed to speak, since I am the one who was actually taken. A ripple of surprise moved through the gathered crowd. Cassius glanced down at his nephew, something proud and protective flickering across his expression, before giving a small nod of permission. Speak, then, said the council elder, his tone gentler now, clearly caught off guard by the boy's composure. Theo straightened his shoulders, his gaze sweeping across the chamber with a determination that silenced any remaining whispers. Lyra did not know who I was when she found me, he said clearly. She thought I was just an injured pup. She gave up her own dinner to keep me warm. She stayed awake all night taking care of me, and she did not know, could not have known, that I would turn out to be anyone important at all. He paused, glancing briefly toward Lyra before continuing, his voice growing steadier with each word. When those wolves took me from my room, she was the one who tracked us to the watchtower before anyone else could. She was the one who tricked them into loosening their grip on me by warning them about my leg, giving me the chance to get away. If she had wanted to hurt me, or use me, she had 100 chances to do it long before that morning. Instead, every single choice she made kept me safe. The chamber remained silent, the weight of a child's honest testimony settling over the room in a way that practiced political maneuvering rarely achieved. That does not explain, Delphine said, though her voice had noticeably lost some of its earlier confidence, how she happened to locate the watchtower so quickly, faster than trained warriors familiar with this territory. I can answer that, Lyra said quietly, finally stepping forward herself, her voice steady despite the dozens of eyes now fixed upon her. I grew up tracking wounded animals through these woods with my father. I recognized the sound of Theo's distress because I had already spent nights caring for him and knew exactly what his voice sounded like when frightened. It was not convenience, Beta Delphine. It was simply familiarity, earned through the very care you now seem determined to punish me for providing. Delphine opened her mouth to respond, but before she could, a nervous voice spoke up from the back of the chamber. I was paid, Oscar blurted suddenly, his voice shaking as every eye in the room turned toward him. Beta Delphine offered me coin to spread rumors about the Omega's involvement. I did not realize how serious this would become. I only wanted the payment. I never intended for anyone to actually believe. Silence, Delphine snapped, her composure finally shattering entirely, though the damage had already been done. Gasps rippled through the chamber, followed quickly by a wave of murmured outrage. Cassius's expression turned to ice as he faced her directly. You fabricated accusations against an innocent woman, he said, his voice low and dangerously controlled, to protect your own ambitions. I did what was necessary, Delphine said, her voice rising, desperation finally cracking through her carefully maintained facade, to protect what I believed was rightfully mine. Our families have discussed this match for months, Cassius. I have waited, I have been patient, and now some nameless Omega appears and suddenly everything I work toward is being handed to her instead. Nothing has been handed to anyone, Cassius said. You built expectations upon assumptions that were never formally promised. And regardless of any past discussions between our families, no ambition, however long held, justifies endangering an innocent person's safety through deliberate lies. The council elder, having listened carefully to the entire exchange, finally rose again. Given the confession just offered before this entire chamber, it is clear the accusations against the Omega known as Lyra are entirely without merit. Beta Delphine, however, will need to answer for her actions before this council separately. Delphine said nothing further, her earlier confidence completely dissolved, as two warriors quietly escorted her from the chamber to await further judgment, her ambitions unraveling in front of the very audience she had hoped to impress. The tension in the room slowly began to ease, murmurs shifting from suspicion toward something closer to quiet respect as the gathered crowd absorbed exactly what had unfolded before them. Lyra, still processing the sudden reversal of fortune, felt her legs weaken slightly with relief, though she remained standing, unwilling to show further vulnerability in front of a chamber that had so recently been prepared to condemn her. Cassius turned to face her fully then, something resolute settling into his expression, the same look she had seen the night he first appeared at her cabin door, though now carrying far greater weight. "I believe," he said, his voice carrying clearly through the chamber, "that this pack owes you more than a simple dismissal of false charges." "Alpha, that is not necessary," Lyra began, but Cassius shook his head gently. "For 3 years," he continued, turning now to address the entire gathered crowd rather than Lyra alone, "this pack has treated kindness as weakness, and status as the only measure of a person's worth. I have watched warriors walk past suffering without a second glance, servants build reputations through fabricated lies rather than honest merit, and an entire community slowly forget the values that once made Blackthorn territory strong under my father's rule." The chamber remained utterly silent, every eye fixed on him. "On the night I found my nephew trapped and injured," Cassius continued, "I watched every single warrior on that ridge walk past him without stopping. Every single one, except for the woman this council nearly condemned today. She had no obligation to help him. She had every reason, given how this pack has treated her, to walk away exactly as everyone else did. Instead, she gave up her own comfort, her own safety, and eventually her own reputation, to protect someone who could offer her nothing in return." He turned back toward Lyra, his golden eyes steady and unwavering. "I do not intend to simply dismiss the charges against you today," he said quietly, though his voice still carried through the silent chamber. "I intend to make clear, before this entire pack, exactly what kind of person you are, and exactly what place you deserve within this territory." Lyra's breath caught, uncertain what he intended, her heart pounding as the entire chamber watched the moment unfold. "Lyra," Cassius said, stepping closer, his voice softening even as it remained firm enough for everyone present to hear clearly, "I had planned to announce a political match during the gathering scheduled for next week, an arrangement built on family expectation rather than genuine choice. I no longer intend to honor that arrangement." Murmurs rippled through the crowd, though no one dared interrupt. "Instead," he continued, "I intend to name, before this entire territory, the person I have come to trust and respect above anyone else within these lands. Not because of family lineage, not because of political convenience, but because of character proven through action, night after night, when no reward was expected in return." He knelt then, before the entire gathered chamber, an act unheard of from an alpha king before anyone beneath his own rank, and reached for Lyra's trembling hand. "I am asking you," he said quietly, though every word still reached every corner of the silent chamber, "to stand beside me not as an afterthought, not as a quiet arrangement built on convenience, but as Luna of Blackthorn territory. Not despite the rank this pack once forced upon you, but because that very rank never once reflected who you actually are." The chamber remained frozen, the weight of the moment settling over everyone present. Lyra felt tears rise unexpectedly in her eyes, 3 years of quiet dismissal and overlooked worth colliding suddenly with a recognition she had never dared to hope for. "I have nothing to offer this pack," she said quietly, her voice trembling slightly. "No status, no family influence, nothing beyond what I already am." "That," Cassius said firmly, rising to his feet and stepping closer still, "is exactly what this pack needs most." Theo, unable to contain himself any longer, broke the silence with an excited grin, tugging gently at Lyra's sleeve. "Say yes," he whispered, loud enough that several nearby wolves could not help but smile despite the solemnity of the moment. Lyra laughed softly through her tears, the sound carrying warmth through a chamber that had, only moments earlier, been prepared to condemn her without hesitation. "Yes," she said finally, her voice growing steadier with each word. "Yes, I will stand beside you." The chamber erupted into a mixture of applause and stunned murmurs, the news certain to spread across every corner of Blackthorn territory before nightfall, transforming the story of the overlooked Omega into something the entire pack would remember for generations. In the days that followed, Blackthorn territory began, slowly but unmistakably, to shift. Warriors who had once walked past suffering without pause found themselves reconsidering old habits under the watchful example set by their new Luna. Servants who had once whispered cruel rumors learned quickly the cost of dishonesty within a court now led by someone who valued truth above convenient status. And Theo, fully recovered and endlessly proud of the role he had played in defending the woman who saved him, remained a constant, cheerful presence at Lyra's side, pressing close against her whenever memories of that stormy night threatened to resurface. Standing together at the edge of the same ridge where Cassius had first witnessed her kindness toward a stranger's pup, Lyra looked out over the territory now bound to her by choice rather than circumstance, Cassius steady beside her, Theo leaning contentedly against her arm. She thought of every wolf who had walked past that ridge without stopping, and she understood now, more clearly than ever, that the very trait they had once mocked as weakness, her refusal to look away from suffering simply because it was easier, had become the exact quality now shaping the future of an entire territory. The overlooked Omega had become Luna, not through ambition or inheritance, but through the simple, unwavering choice to help someone when no one else would, and Blackthorn territory, watching closely, finally understood exactly what it meant to be truly seen.